You really think a man with 2 artificial knees is gonna find what a $2 million drone can?
You really think a man with 2 artificial knees is going to find what a $2 million drone couldn't? The young captain didn't bother lowering his voice. He stood with his arms crossed near the command tent, watching as the old man with the faded Vietnam veteran cap accepted a battered pair of Bushnell binoculars from the rangemaster. Roy Calloway was 78 years old. His back didn't straighten quite the way it used to. His left hand carried a small tremor he tried to keep hidden, the kind that comes from too many years and too much coffee, and a body that has been asked to do things most men never ask of theirs. He had spent the morning sitting in a folding chair under a canvas shade, drinking lukewarm coffee from a thermos, listening to a multi-million-dollar surveillance suite fail at the one job it had been built to do: find a single man hidden somewhere across 400 acres of mixed pine, scrub, and creek bottom. Roy didn't answer the captain. He asked. He didn't even look at him. He nodded once at Major Henley, the range coordinator who had walked over with an apologetic half-smile and a question that had been meant mostly as a joke. If you believe that certain kinds of knowledge can never be downloaded, comment still sharp before this story's over, because what happened in the next 4 minutes is going to make you think twice about who the real experts in this country actually are. They had brought Roy Calloway out to the Camp Ashby National Guard training range as a piece of decoration. That was the honest truth of it, even if no one would have said it out loud. The base had a Veteran Outreach Day on the calendar, a way to show the older men who had given their best years to this country that they were remembered, that the new generations of soldiers still cared enough to shake their hands and let them tour the motor pool and watch a few squads run live-fire drills. Roy had come because his grandson had asked him to come. 12 men from the local VFW post had carpooled out together, mostly Korea and Vietnam, 2 from Desert Storm, 1 quiet old man from the Battle of the Bulge, who didn't say much and didn't need to. Roy had spent most of the morning hanging back, drinking his coffee, watching the younger soldiers move with that particular brand of confidence that he remembered from his own 20s. He didn't begrudge them their certainty. He had been that certain once. Life had a way of sanding that down. He wore khaki pants that had seen better summers, a flannel shirt against the early autumn chill, and a faded ball cap that read Vietnam Veteran with a little embroidered patch from MACVSOG that nobody on the base seemed to notice, or if they noticed, didn't recognize. He had a hearing aid in his right ear and a slight limp from a piece of shrapnel that had decided after 50 years of patience to start hurting in cold weather. He did not look like a man you would call when the technology stopped working. That morning the technology had stopped working. The exercise had been built up for months. Camp Ashby was hosting a joint training event with a contractor demonstration component, and the contractor in question had wheeled in a surveillance package that the briefing officer had described with visible pride as state-of-the-art. There were 2 Puma drones with thermal and electro-optical sensors. There were 4 smaller quadrotor units with high-magnification gimbals. There was a portable command console running a target recognition algorithm trained on military-pattern human silhouettes, capable of flagging a man-shaped heat signature at over a kilometre through light foliage. The whole suite cost just north of $2 million. The scenario was simple. A single instructor-grade sniper, Sergeant First Class Daniel Voss, one of the best instructors at the Army Sniper School at Fort Benning, had been given 6 hours to insert himself anywhere across 400 acres of training range and build a hide. The drone team had 2 hours after that to find him. The bet, unofficial but well understood, was that the drones would find him in under 40 minutes. Voss was good, but the algorithm was a beast. The contractor's project lead had been telling anyone who would listen that the days of the human spotter were numbered. The 2 hours had now stretched to 2 hours and 17 minutes. The Pumas had completed 3 full grid passes. The quadrotors had been retasked to focus on the most likely concealment corridors along the creek bottoms and the tree lines. The algorithm had flagged 41 possible contacts. Every single one had been a false positive: a deer, a fallen log, a patch of warmer soil, an irrigation pipe sticking up at the wrong angle. The contractor was sweating through his polo shirt. The young captain, Captain Brennan, who had been brought in as the embedded drone team officer because he was supposed to represent the future of small unit YesR, had stopped making confident jokes about an hour ago. Major Henley, who had run rifle ranges for 22 years and had a son in Voss's battalion, had been watching the whole circus with the polite patience of a man who has seen many bright ideas meet many old realities. When he walked over to where Roy Calloway was sitting and asked, with a smile that he tried to keep light, whether the old man wanted to take a look, it was not entirely a joke. It was maybe 70% a joke. The other 30% was Henley remembering a story his father had told him once. A story about a man in a Vietnam veteran cap who had been at a regimental reunion in 2003 and had quietly pointed out to an entire room of younger snipers a flaw in a hide photograph that none of them had spotted. He didn't know if the man in his father's story was Roy Calloway. He didn't know if Roy Calloway was anything more than a friendly old gentleman with a tremor in his hand. But the drones weren't working, and the contractor was sweating, and somewhere out there a sergeant first class was probably grinning to himself in a hide, and Henley figured what was the harm. The harm, according to Captain Brennan, was that it made the whole event look unserious. He said this loud enough that Roy heard it. Roy did not respond. He took the binoculars, asked Henley quietly which direction the sniper had inserted from, listened to the answer and asked one more question. Which way was the wind at sunrise? Henley checked his clipboard. Out of the southeast, about 4 knots. Died off around 0800. Roy nodded. He stood up slowly, working the stiffness out of his right knee, and started walking toward the eastern observation tower. The tower wasn't tall, maybe 40 feet, but it was the highest point on the friendly side of the range, and it gave a clean view across most of the training area. Roy climbed the ladder one rung at a time. Halfway up, he stopped to rest. Captain Brennan, watching from below, said something under his breath that one of the drone operators pretended not to hear. The young sergeant with the clipboard, the one who had been quiet all morning, watched Roy climb and did not say anything at all. He was a little embarrassed to realise that he was holding his breath. Roy reached the top of the tower. He took off his cap, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, put the cap back on with the bill pulled lower against the sun, and lifted the binoculars to his eyes. The first thing he did was nothing. He just looked. For maybe 40 seconds he didn't sweep, didn't scan, didn't focus on any one thing. He just let the whole range settle into his vision, the way a man lets a familiar painting settle when he hasn't seen it for a while. Then, very slowly, he began to glass from left to right, and then back from right to left, working in overlapping bands the way he had been taught to do in a humid country a long time ago. Back when the man teaching him had been a Korean war sniper named Truscott, who chewed tobacco and didn't believe in compliments. Roy was not looking for a man. He was looking for what was wrong. That was the first lesson, the one nobody ever wrote down in a manual because it couldn't be written. A drone could be programmed to look for a man. A drone could be trained on 10,000 photographs of men in ghillie suits, and men under cam netting, and men flat in the prone behind logs. But a drone could not look for what was wrong, because what was wrong was different every time. What was wrong, this morning, was a magpie. Roy lowered the binoculars after about 2 minutes and watched a single magpie with his naked eye. The bird circled twice over a section of creek bank about 800 metres out and then banked sharply away to the south, the way a bird does when it has decided that a place it had intended to land is not, after all, a place to land. Roy watched it. He waited. About 30 seconds later, a second magpie did the same thing, in roughly the same place. He raised the binoculars again, this time pointed exactly where the birds had refused to settle. He looked for a long time. Then he lowered the binoculars, climbed back down the ladder one careful rung at a time, walked over to where Major Henley was standing and said, in a voice so quiet that Captain Brennan had to lean in to hear it, "He's in the creek bank, not on top of it. About 800 metres east-northeast of this tower, just south of where the old fence line bends. He cut a hide into the dirt underneath the root ball of that big sycamore. Your drones have been looking down on top of him. They needed to be looking sideways into the bank. He's facing west. Tell your boy to come on home." Major Henley stared at him. Captain Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again. The contractor's project lead, who had walked up during Roy's last sentence, said, "How could you possibly?" Roy didn't let him finish. He just said, "Birds won't land where a man's been breathing recently, especially not magpies, especially not when the wind died at 0800 and never came back." Major Henley got on the radio. 3 minutes later, 2 members of the opposing force safety team walked into the creek bottom where Roy had pointed. 4 minutes after that, the radio crackled with a tight, slightly disbelieving voice. "Range, this is safety 2. We have eyes on Sergeant Voss. He's in a cut-bank hide facing west under the root ball of a sycamore, exactly where the visiting gentleman said he'd be. He's asking who spotted him." Major Henley keyed the mic. He looked at Roy Calloway, who was looking at the ground with a quiet, almost embarrassed expression, like a man who had not meant to make a scene. "Tell him a Vietnam scout sniper named Roy Calloway spotted him," Henley said. "Tell him it took 4 minutes." There was a long pause on the other end of the radio. Then a different voice came on. Older, harder, the voice of a man who had been listening on the command channel. "Did you say Calloway? Roy Calloway? Is that man still on this base, Major?" Henley looked at Roy. "Yes, sir. He's right here." "Don't let him leave. I am 5 minutes out." Captain Brennan was no longer smiling. He was looking at the old man in the Vietnam veteran cap with an expression he was trying hard to keep neutral and failing. 5 minutes later, a black government SUV came down the access road and stopped in a small cloud of dust. The man who got out of it was a brigadier general, in working uniform, with the patch of 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment on his shoulder and grey at his temples. He was maybe 60, fit, walking fast. He did not look at Captain Brennan. He did not look at the contractor. He walked straight to Roy Calloway, stopped 2 paces away, and came to attention. Then he saluted. Roy looked surprised. He returned the salute slowly with a hand that still had its small tremor and said, "Son, you don't need to do that." "Yes, sir, I do," the general said. He held the salute another full second before dropping it. Then he turned to face Major Henley and Captain Brennan and everyone else on that range, and he said, loud enough that no one had to strain to hear him, "Gentlemen, the man you have been standing next this morning is Master Sergeant Roy Calloway, United States Army, retired. 3 tours in Vietnam, attached to Command and Control North, MAC VSOG, Recon Team ASP. 63 confirmed long-range engagements in country, of which 41 are still classified. After Vietnam, he was one of the first 4 instructors at the United States Army Sniper School when it stood up at Fort Benning in 1987. He wrote the original cut-bank hide detection module that they still teach there. The reason your drone couldn't find Sergeant Voss this morning, Captain, is that Sergeant Voss built his hide using a technique that Master Sergeant Calloway personally developed in 1971. There is a chapter in the school's instructor manual named after him. You have probably read it." Captain Brennan's face went the colour of old ash. The contractor's project lead was looking at his own shoes. Major Henley, who had figured out who Roy was the moment he had said the words, "in the creek bank, not on top of it," was smiling the kind of small, quiet, deeply satisfied smile that comes when an old story finally lands in the right place. Roy Calloway took off his cap. He held it in both hands the way men of his generation used to hold their hats, in the presence of something they respected, and he said, "Sergeant Voss did good work this morning. Tell him from me he picked a fine hide. The drones were the only thing he had any right to assume. The birds gave him up, they always do. He'll remember it the next time." The Brigadier General, whose father had been Roy's spotter in the Central Highlands in 1969 and 1970, and who had grown up hearing the name Roy Calloway said in the same tone other men used to say the names of their own grandfathers, escorted the old scout sniper down off that range himself. He carried Roy's coffee thermos. He walked at Roy's pace. They had a great deal to talk about. The contractor packed up his $2 million surveillance suite that afternoon and drove it back to Northern Virginia in a quieter mood than the one he'd arrived in. Captain Brennan, to his credit, walked over to Roy before the old veterans loaded back into their van and apologized in front of his men. Roy shook his hand and told him he was going to be a fine officer if he remembered, going forward, that every old man at every outreach day has spent 50 years quietly carrying something the country forgot to ask about. Sergeant First Class Voss came in from the field on his own 2 feet, walked straight up to Roy and asked him to sign the front cover of his dog-eared copy of the Sniper School's instructor manual. Roy did. He signed it slow, with a tremor in his hand, in the same careful script he had used to sign range cards in a country far away a long time ago. The next month the Army Sniper School invited Roy back to Fort Benning to lecture for 2 days. He went. He used a cane. He spoke softly. The room was full. The captain, who had stood with his arms crossed near the command tent at Camp Ashby, is now a major, and he keeps a photograph in his office of an old man in a faded Vietnam veteran cap, climbing a 40-foot tower 1 rung at a time, to remind him to shut his mouth more often than he opens it. There are men in this country who walk through grocery stores with caps pulled low and shrapnel that still aches in cold weather, and the country walks past them and has no idea what is standing 2 feet away. We forget our old soldiers. We forget that experience is the one thing nobody can build a drone to replace. $2 million couldn't find a man in 400 acres of pine. A 78-year-old in a folding chair found him in 4 minutes because he was looking for what was wrong, and what was wrong was a bird that wouldn't land. If this story moved you, if you believe that the old men in faded ball caps deserve our respect long after the country has forgotten their names, hit that subscribe button right now and join this channel. We tell the stories of the men this country owes more than it remembers. Comment still sharp if you made it to the end. Share this with a young soldier who needs to hear it, and the next time you see an old veteran sitting quietly in the corner, buy him his coffee. You have no idea what he can see.